now get the perspective of Dean Armstrong, QC, who's a barrister specialising in data law. I would imagine, Dean, you are finding this whole story extremely fascinating. Give us your insight into what's going on here.
Well, I think it's the principles behind it are whose data, who actually controls personal data. There's a big debate going on which is being resolved in favour in Europe of the individual having control over their own data. And that's a massive boost and step forward for those people who see opportunities like this and situations like this whereby their data has been misused. This is a classic example of you give someone permission to use data for a particular purpose. In this situation, not only their own data but also other people's data has been used for a completely different purpose on the face of it.
Now, I was going to say next month, it's in May, isn't it?
May 25th, yes.
GDPR comes in. This is a new data protection regulation in Europe, which many companies are trying to get their heads around and prepare for. I mean, how would this impact this scenario that's playing out right now with Facebook, Cambridge Analytica and others?
Well, it's very topical because obviously CA are a UK-based company.
Yeah, Cambridge Analytica.
Cambridge Analytica, and in those circumstances, they would be obliged to be compliant with GDPR. GDPR at its root and at its function is it puts people's personal data at the top of the agenda in the sense that you have the ability to control your own data. So anybody else who uses your data, effectively are a custodian of your data. They are people looking after it. It's a prized possession. And so what we have is this rather interesting dichotomy at the moment in the world, because what we have in the Facebook situation is you've got a scenario whereby someone's data is being misused, it's being out of their control. GDPR is saying that's wrong and that's punishable.
But how do you pursue this scenario? If you're a Facebook user or a user of some other form of social media, or even you feel another organisation has misused your data, is it really realistic to think you're going to get some kind of justice through this system, especially where in this situation Facebook's saying, we haven't done anything wrong, but we are going to look back and do an internal investigation into what happened. Cambridge Analytica as a company is also saying they're denying any wrongdoing as well. So how do you figure out who's at fault and somehow see some sort of reprisal here?
But what we have at the moment obviously is a very unclear evidential situation, and so what has to happen over the next days, weeks, months is to clarify fault, who was responsible, did people do as much as they could do in terms of due diligence. But under the GDPR, for example, if it happened in the European space or it happened to a European citizen, they would have a right of redress under the regulation itself.
What do you think will happen to Facebook given this situation we're looking at now?
Well, I think what's interesting is that there may have been, I'm not suggesting on the part of Facebook, but generally perhaps some reluctance to face up to the fact that people's data is their own data. And I think what will happen after this will be the realisation that it's you as a big entity such as Facebook look after other people's possessions, and you must take more care with it. You must ensure that it's used properly. And I hope, and in those circumstances I do believe, that will lead to a greater responsibility over the use of data and how it's dealt with.
All right, interesting. Thank you very much for coming in. Dean Armstrong, who's QC barrister specialising in data law, and this is a story we will continue to cover and something we'll return to. Of course, GDPR, a huge issue for companies all over the world. Now, let's